All right, so in our last video, part one of two, we talked a little bit about the cultural and historical and political context that Ovid was writing in. We talked a little bit about Virgil, just so that we could draw a contrast to Ovid's project. And then we talked just a little bit about uh, the intention behind writing the Metamorphoses, and then a little bit of their structure, their thematic content. So in this video, we are going to talk further about those themes that we will encounter in the stories so that you can keep an eye out for them. And then we'll briefly do a little bit of a summary of the portions of the text that you will be reading. Now, once again, this is just to give you some information to hang the stories on. This is just to provide you with a little bit of initial help to get you going on this process. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. The themes and ideas of the Metamorphoses. Now, in any text, as we talked about with Lysistrata, you will obviously bring your own kind of interpretation, your own context to the story, and you may pick up on themes that are not listed here. You may notice motifs and symbols and, draw some further conclusions about what the stories have to tell us. You may notice, comparisons to other things that we've read. But these are just some of the things that are kind of most commonly found throughout the epic. So obviously one of the themes that comes up over and over again is, as we discussed, metamorphoses, naturally. The ways that the characters shift and change over time, when they do so suddenly, physical changes, emotional changes, etc. And then the effects of those changes. What are their causes? What are their effects? And then sort of a lot of different themes branching off that one big idea. Another theme that we will see really often is personal suffering and the ways that characters find to transcend personal suffering, even if it's just for a little while. Oftentimes characters are put into situations that they have no control over or that they are not responsible for, and the book is full of ways that the characters kind of manage their suffering, that they mitigate their emotional responses, or ways that they find to turn that suffering into something beautiful. That, more than anything else, is the way that Ovid seems to treat the concept of personal suffering, is as a kind of fertile ground for transcendence and creation. Which leads us into our next theme. One of the ways that characters often transcend or mitigate their suffering is through the power of art. And throughout the text, partially because Ovid himself, sees himself as an artist, he comes back to again and again the really transformative, get it, metamorphoses, transformation, the transformative power of art. But genuinely, the power of art to change our situation in life, or to change our outlook on that situation, or the power of art to effect real change. One of the things that he keeps coming back to is the violence and tragedy of romantic love. A lot of the relationships in the story are either explicitly violent or abusive or non-consensual, but just as often they are very tender and loving, and there is some kind of outside violence or tragedy that gets in the way. He also spends a lot of time discussing kind of the fragility of life and love, and kind of the power of love to once again mitigate that fragility, or even the kind of the absurdity of life and kind of tragedy, the way that sometimes there's no real meaning in tragedy and we have to kind of create our own meaning. A lot of his romantic stories have some kind of element of chance in them. As we'll see with Orpheus and Eurydice, sometimes the tragedy that breaks into romantic love doesn't happen for a reason, it just happens, which makes it all the more tragic because there's no one that you can even really hold responsible for it. So he does a lot of this discussion thinking about, tragedy, violence, the power of art and love. So really we can kind of think about almost kind of a yin and yang, or like light side of the force, dark side of the force kind of set of ideas, some binaries that Ovid is really working with here, where you have love and violence, or joy and suffering, art and suffering, these kind of binary pairs that he's drawing, and examining the ways that they feed off of one another, or that they alter and shape each other. And then finally, we mentioned this in the last video, one of the things that he keeps coming back to in both a thematic and kind of a motif sense is the power and use of meta stories, or of playing with narrative structure. So again, he loves embedded stories, he loves parallel stories, he loves flashbacks, and he really loves sort of using this narrator Ovid version of himself, which in its own right implies a larger framed story. So these are just some of the things that we'll encounter as we read the texts. There are absolutely some other things that will show up, things that you may notice. Keep your eyes peeled for any ideas that come up as motifs, and a motif is just anything that kind of little concept that shows up again and again and again and again and again, and seems to be pointing to a larger theme. So, quick summaries. In book one is the intro. Book one starts with an invocation of the muse. Now, this invocation of the muse is a little bit unconventional, because Ovid doesn't just invoke one god, he invokes all of them. Now, by invoking all of the gods, Ovid is making sure that he cannot offend any one god by leaving them out. Also, by doing so, it may be that he is just kind of paying lip service to them. By including all of them, it kind of weakens the power of his invocation. So maybe he's trying to make it more about himself than the gods, or maybe he's just trying to cover all of his bases. Book one also starts with both a creation story and a flood narrative, wherein all of the humans have become deeply immoral and there is only one good man and one good woman left, and so the gods go ahead and flood the rest of the earth, and those two people must repopulate afterward. But what book one really gets at is kind of demonstrating an age of instability, by talking about how flawed the humans are. But this first book also gets at how even the gods themselves seem to be kind of irrational and immoral. The actions they take in book one often seem very capricious, rather than doing them for, the actions that they take for any specific moral or religious or logical reason. They just kind of do stuff because they feel like it. So book one really indicates that this first age is one of upheaval, of change, of chaos, which is in and of itself a kind of metamorphosis. Now, book two includes more gods behaving badly. The piece of book two that we're going to read is very short, but it does include more examples of gods and transformations. And in this book, transformations are used most often as a way to shift or remove guilt. So, you kind of think about oh, a god raped this woman, so then, she was turned into a tree so that no one had to worry about her anymore. Or, Zeus changed into a bull so that he could rape this woman, but he was a bull, so no one knew it was Zeus. So transformations here do have a shadier purpose, as a way to assuage someone's guilty conscience. We move on to book 5 afterward, where Ovid draws attention to just how different he is to his predecessors. In this book, we really see him kind of come into the fullness of his artistic effort. He plays with embedded stories and the ways that characters share narrative with each other. This book also, as we will find out, really shows where his personal priorities lie, in that he demonstrates great respect in his stories for art and music, but the way he treats warfare is with, at best, humor, and maybe even so much as outright contempt. Book 9. Book 9 has 2 paired stories, of which unfortunately we will only read one. but these are ruminations on the social and biological aspects of love. So in the story that we're not going to read, what we get is a brother and sister who fall in love, which of course is socially extremely taboo. But for Ovid, because they are a heterosexual pair, he sees it as, well, in a way it's treated in the story as being sort of biologically acceptable, but they still have to figure out how to get out of this pickle where they did an incest. Meanwhile, in the story that we will be reading, we have a orphan who is a girl raised as a boy who then becomes betrothed to a girl. When the fiance finds out that her betrothed is actually a woman, she still loves her. Now, biologically, for Ovid, this is a problem because this is a homosexual pairing, and for Ovid, the narrator, there's no biological imperative because they can't have children. But because socially, one of them is living as a man, it is socially seen as an acceptable pairing. So he kind of works with these kind of contrasted stories. And one of the stories, the one that we're going to read, has a happy ending. They figure out a way around their problem. But the story that we don't read that has deals with that incest taboo, it does end tragically because they are unable to overcome the taboo nature of their relationship. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in this book, especially, particularly if you're interested in doing any work with gender or sexuality. There's a lot of really kind of interesting stuff happening from both an ancient perspective and a modern one. But moving on, we come to book 10, where Pygmalion, which you may have heard of, is an embedded story in the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, which we'll read separately. Now, Pygmalion is largely a quest to gain love through the power of art. And then the second part of book 10 that we'll read is the story of Venus and Adonis, which explores the power and pain of love in sort of the opposite way that Pygmalion does. Again, these are sort of paired stories. Venus and Adonis also seems to be arguing potentially for a positive correlation between love and suffering, in that the more that you love someone, the more that you are going to suffer. So then finally we will read separately Orpheus and Eurydice, which is an insanely popular story. Virgil wrote a version of it. We're going to read a medieval version of it. There was literally, like, last year, just like a Broadway musical made out of it. If you've like seen or heard of Hadestown, that's just a retelling of Orpheus and Eurydice. So Orpheus and Eurydice also speaks of sort of the power of art as a way to both demonstrate love and a way to channel love to affect real change. It also discusses the tragic flaws of humanity and that same correlation between love and suffering. We're also going to examine closely the common motif of community versus wilderness, just because that's something that comes up a lot in these stories. What is the place of community? How does it function? And then what is the place of the wilderness, and what does it seem to represent? So that is my quick summary for you. These notes will also be posted as a slide deck on Canvas, so that if I talked super fast, or if you just don't want to listen to me talk for like half an hour, you can just look at the slides. But yeah, it's up to you. We will be going a little more in depth with a couple of these stories as the week continues, but otherwise, enjoy.